I am the master of
As
everything.
long as you can hear me, it's fine.
Okay, okay, whatever. I won't ask questions.
Don't ask questions. That's right. You're just following orders,
Yeah, yeah, like the Nazis.
like the Nazis. God, these cold opens just fucking make themselves, don't they?
Yeah, this might actually be part of the episode.
Oh, he
That's
knows.
fine.
I told him
That's
before you
fine.
got here, Shadi. So we should perhaps intro our guest this time, Shadi, as my former brilliant colleague Aaron Sibarium, who is currently at the Washington Free Beacon. What's your title there, Aaron?
I think associate editor.
Associate editor.
You think?
I think that's what they call me, so I guess that's what it is.
Were you a philosophy major at Yale? I forget.
No, so I was something called ethics, politics, and economics, but I kind of used it to take a lot of philosophy, and in retrospect, I should have done just pure philosophy because I would have liked it more. But yeah, I mean, I'm interested in all sorts of weird analytic philosophy stuff.
And as Aaron's editor, it's been my never-ending task to try and make him do less philosophy in his essays, or at least less overtly. That's been my task as I've seen it in many cases since I've known Aaron.
And you largely, I think, succeeded with this most recent one that we're going to talk about.
Yeah.
Well, and I want to say something about Aaron too, but before that, I think it's time.
Time for the marketing pitch. Go, Shadi, go.
I'm so good at this now. Okay, guys, I think that you should become a paying member of Wisdom of Crowds. If you like what we do and you want to support us as we try to grow the website, do more, bring more people like Aaron on, I think you have a very strong incentive in joining us and being part of our community. And it's only for the price of a latte, depending on where you get your lattes per month, just $5. So you can subscribe at wisdomofcrowds.live/subscribe.
Shadi, are you insinuating that we're paying Aaron and that they need to that they need to pay money to get stuff like Aaron on the podcast?
No, but I mean, just in terms of like, we'll be able to like produce, I don't know. Don't ask too many questions, but
Yeah.
the basic idea is that we want to build our community.
Agree.
Don't you want to get Obama on the podcast?
Yes, that is one of our
Yes,
long-term goals.
Do we have to
think
pay
that would be
Obama to
good.
come to the podcast? That's the other question. Doesn't Obama do this out of the kindness of his heart, or does he ask for six figures?
I think he charges like $10,000 per podcast episode. Actually, I'm just making that up, but who knows? It's possible.
I mean, speakers
Okay.
bureaus, yeah. Anyway, go on.
Okay, but I do want to say something about our dear guest. I have talked about him in the past as one of the great young conservative writers in America today. A lot of qualifiers there, but it's still really important.
True fact. I mean, in the same way that I'm the most important Croatian writer today, right, Shadi?
Except Croatian American.
Croatian American, not even Croatian. True.
Yeah, and to be fair, the universe of possibilities there is like 5 people.
Precisely.
With young conservative writers in America today.
Much
we're probably
bigger.
talking about 1,000 people.
That's right. No, I think Aaron's much more accomplished in that way.
Yeah, he's probably in the top 5 of the 1,000 young conservative writers.
I might amend conservative to not on the left.
Interesting.
And be I'm willing. I think it might be an accurate label, but I'm agnostic about its applicability. To
Well,
me.
that's
Let me
interesting.
just
I mean, we
put it
should
that
actually
way.
unpack that a little bit, Aaron,
Yeah.
since we have you on here. I mean, do you feel in general, I mean, I've always felt this way, even though I tend to sort of, especially as I grow older, like, lean to the right, but I've always hated the C word. And I wonder you as someone coming up right now, whether like, the taint of conservatism, what it's becoming is, whether you feel like it's a real liability for you.
I don't know if I'd say it's so much that it's a liability as that I think it just it may be inaccurate insofar as I depart from conservatives on a lot of pretty big questions, or at least now I think what the other problem is that what conservative and liberal mean has changed so much, in part as a result of the Great Awakening, that I think it may well be that within 10 years, just ordinary conservative in ordinary discourse is going to mean anti-woke, and that's it.
So Shadi will be a conservative at that point.
Right. Like, I think that actually maybe not quite that far, but I think that is actually quite plausible. But right now, I think we're in kind of a weird transitional phase, and I would say I'm culturally conservative insofar as I believe that there is a kind of concerted ideological assault on aspects of our heritage and aspects of, say, the great books and pillars of liberalism and Western civilization that needs to be combated. But I would say that's cultural conservatism is not the same thing as what I would call social conservatism, which in practice means pro-life, critical of gay marriage, things like that, and on all sorts of social issues.
So you don't support life?
Sure. I mean, look,
who among us supports life? Come on.
I mean, we can even get into this later, but I will say, I'm sympathetic to where pro-life people are coming from, but ultimately, I think if as I do, you don't believe that it's murder, that does create some cleavages. Like I know a lot of people who I think might be voting for Biden, but for the abortion issue, and they're either not going to vote or they're going to vote for Trump, and I think that's pretty intellectually consistent.
Yeah. Do you support universal health care?
Yes, although...
Do you think health care is a right?
Not a right. Come on.
Everyone should have access to it if possible. In reality, we face a very complicated series of trade-offs that may, between, say, access, accessibility, and quality, and all sorts of other things. And so I'm agnostic about whether single payer is better or, say, what I think like the catastrophic care system Singapore does. I don't think the GOP has any healthcare plan. So this is another example too. Like, conservative can mean a lot of different things. I'm not a Republican. I think the Republican Party is horrible, and the Democrats. But I think like the failure of Trump in the last debate, just to take one concrete example, to articulate anything like a coherent healthcare plan is embarrassing.
Crap! I forgot to watch that.
Don't watch it. But suffice it to say, Republicans don't know anything about healthcare, and to me, they're so stupid on so many issues that I just, as someone who considers himself not completely stupid, to support the institutionalized GOP, I just can't do it.
Yeah. You know what would be an interesting idea for a podcast? It's sort of called Why Aaron is Not a Conservative, ? And every episode is like me and Damir just asking you questions one after the other about random things that you believe.
And it could be like a spinoff. It's a spinoff.
Yeah, it could be like 10 episodes over the course of the year, and that's like literally all we do. I don't know if there's a big audience for that.
No,
though.
I mean,
but let's unpack this just a little bit more though. It's just like I guess where to start. The question again, I want to push you on this.
Yeah, dude.
The conservative thing. Fine, you're into conserving great books. You're not technically a religious conservative, though you, like most people, understand the importance of religion in something for social cohesion, right? Why are you shying away from the C word? Because you said that was what we started this on. Where's the repulsion coming from? Mainly because you're not pro-life?
No, that's not the only reason, although I think that to some extent, I mean, you even said it yourself, these labels are kind of...
essentializing.
And here's the thing, right? In America, at least, look, so during the Bush years, right? I think if you were pro-choice and pro-gay marriage during the Bush years... I don't know if it's really meaningful to say you were a conservative. I guess maybe you could say you were socially liberal but fiscally conservative. I'm not even really fiscally conservative insofar as I, am fine with government doing all sorts of things.
But don't bring in gay marriage. I mean, Obama was against gay marriage, right?
No,
right.
So
that's
I know.
The other part. That's just like an anachronism, really.
But that's the thing. But that's just it. It seems like to me conservatism is a I think Huntington called it a situational ideology, and he had a sort of minimalist definition, which was it just means that kind of take a given order as worth conserving and worth conserving in the face of threats to that order, and it really doesn't have much more content beyond that. And I think Huntington was probably right. I mean, you could add a few more clauses to that definition, but I think it suffices for our purposes. But the thing is, there are certain aspects of the present order that I think are under threat that I want to conserve. There's other things that are under threat that I don't necessarily think we should conserve. And because Trump has scrambled the sort of battle lines, I just don't know if in kind of a analytic, positivistic sense, it's accurate to call myself a conservative. But I should say, I used to shy away from the label in the sense of, no, you shouldn't associate me with those guys. And now I'm like, well, I don't mind if you associate me with conservatism. I just don't know if it's accurate. Much in the same way, I think a lot of the neocons resisted the label very aggressively at first, and then my sense is that later in their life, I think they just stopped caring. Yeah, like I don't know if this is accurate. Nathan Glazer believed what he believed, right?
Yeah.
And I'm not comparing myself to Nathan Glazer, but the point is the point is that the point is that these guys got pigeonholed as conservatives, and we call them neoconservatives. They didn't really identify as such at the time. Whether they were conservative in some linguistic or ontological sense,
I mean, Irving Kristol invented the term, right? Am I misremembering my history there? Didn't he come up with the neoconservative persuasion?
A liberal mugged by reality or something like that.
Yeah.
But Damir, I fear that we're asking the wrong question. If the goal is to understand why Aaron is what he is or is not, I think the right question would be, what team are you on? Because that's really what this is about.
No,
I mean, no. I mean, I'm being serious here. I don't think that to know if someone's a conservative or not, we shouldn't be asking necessarily about details on policies, because I want to conserve aspects of our current order, and I think many Democrats do. That doesn't make them conservative. They're
right.
Democrats because they're Democrats.
Right.
Because they have decided to be consciously part of a particular tribe, regardless of whether or not they kind of align with a specific set of policy prescriptions. Like, why is that unreasonable?
No, I mean, it's reasonable. I mean,
that's why I'm a Democrat.
But I mean, the reason that I enjoy doing this podcast with you, Shadi, is that you're much more complicated than that. And in fact, you're less of a team player. You like to throw a bomb in your team's tent, as you have in the Atlantic the last few times.
It's still my team, though.
Sort of. But you're gonna get expelled from it, just like the neocons did.
But here's okay. But to maybe meet Damir's challenge a little more head on by reframing it in Shadi's terms, I don't identify as being on the left. I mean, I think the left increasingly just means a set of things really well beyond, say, just support for universal health care or whatever. I mean, I think, frankly, there are a lot of people who are conservative who support that in some form. That's not what being on the left seems to be about in the main anymore. It does seem to be much more about identity politics and identity issues and a set of cultural sensibilities I do not share. And furthermore, I'll throw this out as a provocation. I think Yasha Monk had some debate with, what was it? Nigel Ferguson or someone.
Neil Ferguson.
Neil Ferguson, yeah. About whether the populist right or the far left or the woke left was a bigger threat. And I lean towards woke left pretty strongly, that's a bigger long-term threat than the populist right. And as we'll get into when we talk about my essay, I hate Trump and I want him out of office, but I don't really see America becoming dangerously right-wing authoritarian anytime soon. I do see something not maybe identical with what Rod Dreher calls soft totalitarianism, but something more in that vein coming from the left. And in terms of certainly what arouses kind of my emotional, what gets me angry, what kind of arouses a real strong emotional response in me, it is more the far left and the woke left than I would say, a Catholic conservative who doesn't like gay marriage. That wasn't always the case, but now I think I have more in common with a, probably, a moderate person at First Things, moderate by First Things as standards, than I do with, a lot of journalists at the New York Times.
Okay, well, this is probably a good segue into talking about your piece, and I'll let Damir sort of do the honors there. But one thing I did want to say is that when I read your piece, maybe I'll just say what the title is. So, what's funny? I just searched for Weimar Aaron to get it up on my screen, and the first thing that came up was Aaron Weimar image comics database. He's a teacher in like the middle of the country, and apparently, I don't know, his last name is Weimar. So clearly you got to do a little bit more to find your article. But the article title is The Weimarization of the American Republic. It was published in American Purpose, which is a new magazine, which is quite good, which I would recommend you guys taking a look at. It came out a few days ago, this piece. It's been getting a lot of hype on the Twitters. And, we can maybe say a couple words about Weimar because not everyone will be familiar with the context here. But I will say that before I came on this podcast episode, I was like, I'm going to make mincemeat out of Aaron's article. I'm going to just destroy it. But I'm not going to do that.
Wow, because you're convinced? Wait, Shadi, why?
Wait, yeah, Shadi, I want to fight. Come on.
Okay, hold on, guys, hold on. Before we launch into this, I do want to just mind this a little bit more on the conservative thing, because I think it actually does lead in. It's right instinct, Shadi, to jump into the article, but I think we can do this a little bit. So you were citing Huntington, Aaron, and at the same time, your description about why you find yourself in this situation is sort of almost consonant with like Lionel Trilling's famous description of conservatism, right? Like a series of irritable mental gestures, like this annoys me, like the wokes annoy me and stuff like that. But then, it ends like going to Shadi's thing about tribes. I think that was also an attempt to sort of set up this article and a reference to sort of Shadi trolling me offline on something else about my sort of annoyances about how journalists are behaving in this moment. I don't know. Let me just maybe turn to you, Shadi, though, before we dive into this, because Aaron's article is very much about, I would say, and Aaron contested later, but like it's about polarization. And it's I think, a look at basically, well, to use the lingo that we use in this podcast sometimes about fallenness, ultimately, that even those people who think they're doing the right thing and are acting heroic in this are part of like potentially part of a broader social dynamic that has a logic of its own that perhaps leads us to bad things. But so, Shadi, talk to me a little bit more. I just want to push you on this you're a Democrat thing, because I'm calling bullshit on you a little bit. Okay. Not that you haven't, that you've fully broken with it, but you're not.
I'm not a Democrat?
You're probably registered as one. I may even be registered as one here so you can vote for mayor and it matters for something.
But Damir, you can't tell me that I'm not something that I am. That's like coming to me and saying that I'm not like a real Muslim or something.
Sort of.
But like on what grounds? Like lay that out for me. What makes you think I'm not a Democrat?
Well, okay. I think that ultimately it's again. Sure. What's a Democrat? I guess is the main thing, you're fighting for a certain kind of direction and thing. But I would say that ultimately you are actually, and this is why I think this conversation has so much promise. You are as annoyed and alienated as I am, and as Aaron sounds like he is as well. So at least in that sense, I would say that. If you still consider yourself a Democrat, you're going to have an awakening pretty soon, Shadi. That's all I'm getting at.
And wait, like, what do you mean?
Not
I'm
an
gonna have
awakening. You're gonna have an awakening when you find yourself on the street, when you're finally like drummed out of the tent.
they're gonna drum me out, is what you're saying.
I suspect they will.
Okay, but look, here's the thing. First of all, the wokes are a small part of the party. And those of us who are in the tent, we are going to fight for the future of left politics, of democratic politics in America. And we're not going to go down without a fight. This is not I mean, the standard bearer of our party is pretty unwoke. He's an old white guy who doesn't know any of the lingo and all that. So most normal Democrats who are not educated elites and not on Twitter, they're just normal people, some of them probably in labor unions, some of them probably like school teachers or something, and they just don't know what this woke stuff is about. I mean, my mom as we've talked about, is a loyal Democratic voter. She doesn't even know what the word woke means. And I suspect there's a lot of ordinary normie type Democrats who have no idea what we're talking about. This is not the Democratic Party.
You were crushed when Biden won.
I was crushed?
You were crushed. Oh, sorry, not when Biden won, but when your communists lost.
Yeah,
and that's the point. I mean,
how does that mean that I'm not? Yeah.
No. Damir, can I just offer 2 points?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So for one, Shadi, the guy who you supported, who I, for the record, like a great deal at least as a person, and I like some of his ideas. He wasn't a registered Democrat for most of his career, right?
Yeah.
Okay?
Right.
So the guy who you most wanted to be the Democratic nominee really only was running as a Democrat because that would make it easier for him to win and make him more competitive. He explicitly defined his career in opposition to the institutional Democratic Party. That's point one.
Okay.
Point two is that I agree with what you're saying descriptively about the average Democrat not being woke, but I think you're making a bit of a leap in assuming that what the average Democrat believes is sort of is constitutive of what the Democratic Party stands for. And the thought experiment I'd use, or the counterexample, is most people who are Republicans are not rich oil executives, right?
Yep.
Almost none are. But rich oil executives have quite a bit of influence in the Republican Party, and there is a very real sense in which the policies and the rhetoric of the Republican Party, before Trump and even during Trump, were shaped by this incredibly small but very influential, powerful constituency within the party. I don't, if anything, I would think that wokeness there are more woke people in the United States and in the Democratic Party than there are oil execs in the Republican Party. And many of those people are the Democrats' kind of more wealthy and more influential donors. So, look, my parents are Biden supporters too, who are like, they don't give a shit about the woke stuff. But my parents also don't write legislation. And that's what worries me.
That's a fair point. That's a fair point.
But what's your team, Shadi? And I'm not saying this just to sort of like go on about this, even though we should get to the article soon. I think it's really is tied to it though, because ultimately the reason why I think that Aaron's article is quite good, even though you're right, as you pointed out in Twitter ahead of this episode, that in fact you and I in our debate about that essay, whatever, we come out in a different place than Aaron, and I want to talk to Aaron about that too. But ultimately, I think the three of us, maybe I'm being too generous or presumptuous in saying this, but I think the reason I like both of you and I consider you my friends is that you're kind of homeless. You kind of have like a healthy disdain for a lot of these institutions. So that's why I know you're trolling because you're Shadi Hamid to say that like it's team sports and you're on team this or that. But you're not really. I mean, as far as I know, you have a suspicion that you're not happy about team sports. And again, just to say why this is important is because one way to read Aaron's essay is to talk about the fact that the perils of sort of team sport thinking in politics, and as this sort of spins out of control, where this leads you. Now, again, I don't know, so Shadi, just react to that and then like take us into your sort of unhappinesses with Aaron's essay.
Okay, well, I do want to clarify that I am not trolling when I say that I think about these things in terms of teams. Now, I don't play team sports, so there could be a misunderstanding about what teams do. So the sport that I played in high school was primarily tennis, which, as I think many of you know, there's only one person on the team, me.
Or doubles.
I did not, well, I did play a little bit of doubles early on, but so look, I mean, I think every team, every group, let's say, and this could apply to a business, a committee, whatever, you need people on that committee who are heterodox, who challenge the groupthink. And what I want to do with my own side, the left side of the spectrum, is to call out people who I think are taking my side in a problematic direction. I think all of us have a responsibility to focus on our own sides, on our own teams or tribes or whatever, and say, hey, we got to look inward here. We got to be self-critical. So when people say, hey, Shadi, you're criticizing these woke leftists all the time, why aren't you freaking out about Trump? Well, first of all, that should be a given that already we know Trump is bad. So I don't think it's intellectually interesting to dwell on that point excessively, because it would just be stating the obvious. But also, it's not really my job as a non-Republican and as a non-Trump supporter to be like focused on that. And that's what I find very odd, that I find that most of the folks on the left on Twitter, they're obsessed with Trump, which seems to be like an odd political choice to me in terms of how we expend our intellectual energy. And also, it's incredibly boring. But apparently, as I have found out, it's incredibly lucrative that people who have made Trump their obsession are now rich people, because apparently there's a constituency for reading all these books about how Trump is evil. So go figure. I guess I'm not in line with the mood. But I mean, that's sort of how I view teams, is that you need a couple self-critical people on your team. Okay, to lead into the article, though, I would maybe want to, and it's interesting how we've sort of talked around the article. So obviously we've raised expectations tremendously, where now people are like, oh my God, this article is probably going to be the best article ever.
True.
I mean, it's probably not the best article ever.
Go on.
In my opinion. But I will say this, I loved reading it. And it's an absolute joy to experience Aaron's prose style, because he inserts these little jokes, but they're not obviously jokes. But because I sort of know Aaron a little bit, I know that he's like, there's a really funny, I can't even like replicate it. Just go read it. We'll include a link in our show notes. But what I would like, before I tell you guys what I think, is maybe, Aaron, give us the 30-second to 1 minute summary of your article.
All
What,
right.
like, if you want to sum up, like, what are you trying to tell us? And maybe it could be like a minute and a half, like not 30 seconds or whatever.
I thought, this isn't the whole thing, but I thought perhaps the most important point from it that Wesley Yang highlighted on Twitter in language that was frankly better than my language was that catastrophizing about Nazism and communism, or just, the far right and the far left, can paradoxically bring about that which one is trying to preempt, and that the Weimar Republic is in fact a paradigm case of that happening. Because, you wouldn't think this, but there actually was a lot of irrational catastrophizing in the Weimar Republic about fascism and communism. It wasn't irrational in the sense that there was no threat. As we all know, there was a threat, but both sides essentially saw everyone who disagreed with them as completely illegitimate. And the far left called the Social Democrats in Germany, who were like the sort of establishment center-left party, the social fascists. And in some cases even said that they were a bigger threat to communism than the National Socialists.
And to clarify, this is happening in the 20s and early 30s.
Yeah. And on the right, you had a similar dynamic where everyone to the left of the right was seen as evil, and liberalism was anathematized as this horrible, corrupt order. And both sides, though for very different reasons, essentially thought that the republic itself was illegitimate. The communists wanted something far more radical. The conservatives wanted to go back to something that clearly could not be recreated, but they were fine with a what they called a conservative revolution to get rid of the Republican rot and install something more aristocratic and ordered, and less kind of degenerate and corrupt. So you had a scenario in which both sides regarded the republic and the constitutional order as illegitimate and regarded each other as illegitimate. And the result was a kind of polarization cycle that eventually made it, if not inevitable, then certainly very probable that the whole thing was going to either just fall apart into chaos or that one side or the other was going to just decisively win and take absolute power. And of course, that is what ended up happening, and it was bad. But
for those of you who don't know what Aaron's referring to, I think he's referring to the rise of the Nazis.
Yes. But what often gets left out of this, I think, not so much in the historiography, but in the popular remembrance of Weimar, is that there really was a communist threat that a lot of people were responding to, and if the communists implausibly had managed to beat all the right-wing forces arrayed against them, and the right in Germany, unlike in America, had a decisive sort of cultural advantage over the left, but assume that the communists had somehow managed to overcome all of that, these were not good people. These were violent Stalinists who, in fact, parroted anti-Semitic rhetoric in order to compete electorally with the Nazis, and were, constantly starting riots and in some cases even cooperating with the Nazis to start riots, against the social democratic controlled police. This was a very unhealthy, divided society, and you really, in retrospect, would not have wanted either the far left or the far right to win.
Here, the essence of it for me is, again, this question of ultimate legitimacy of something, and then the kind of righteousness of politics. And this is, the sort of challenge to Chantal Mouffe and, Shadi's favorite agonism, basically. I don't think, Shadi, you disagree with any of this. Ultimately, though, is that, if you don't have that, or I don't think even Chantal Mouffe disagrees with it, if you don't have that overarching legitimacy in which to couch the kind of contested politics, it all comes apart. And what I liked about your telling of it, Aaron, even though I do think that we can disagree about the analysis of the current moment. Maybe that's where Shadi's going to head, but it's the fact that again. There are no real heroes in this. And, I was, for a different telling of this period, I forget the name of Sherry Berman's book, but, she talks about the rise of social democracy, and she talks about basically, the mellowing of that sort of, 19th century rise of, the sort of the hard believing communists, and how that over time and, through the crucible of World War II and into the 20th century developed into this sort of bedrock of European left partyism. But I think her telling really does a disservice to this. And I think her telling is actually kind of hegemonic in a lot of the ways that people look at this period. As they work backwards from Hitler. They see that the unique horrors of the Nazi regime, and therefore even impute a certain kind of decency and goodwill to those that stood against Hitler, even if they were communists. And I think that misses that point. I think that's the most powerful point. And, to me, that's the main lesson of the essay for today's moment. There's too many people who are far too self-satisfied about themselves. And in fact, that's one of those things in our little back and forth, Shadi, that really sort of came to me is that these people, these resistance folks, I'm not saying, that they are some sort of cause to all of this, but they're very much enabled by Trumpism, and they're very much reacting to it. But they are I don't know, equally is some sort of measurement, but they are toxic. They are a toxic force to our republic. I think Aaron's essay gets at that dynamic really well. That in fact, insofar as like what's happening in our politics, not necessarily writ large in our republic, but in our politics, is this sort of self-reinforcing, righteous thing, and being as it's overlaid on sort of a period of delegitimation of the broader narrative, I think there's something to be worried about, and I think that's where Aaron like sort of hits it on the head.
Yeah, and I think that so the first half of the article, and it's a long essay with a lot of ideas packed in, which is part of what makes it a really great piece to engage with. I think that the analysis of the Weimar moment was actually fascinating. Quite a few things that I wasn't, fully aware of in terms of the sequence of events and the role of the communists, for example. I guess my issue is the application of Weimar's lessons to American politics. And I was trying to think about like why I just couldn't get on board with the more speculative parts in the second half of the piece. And I think it's my ideological priors don't allow me to be comfortable with most historic analogies. I don't like it when people bring up Germany in any period in the first half of the 20th century to talk about American politics today. So I think I have a sort of instinctual recoil when I see the analogizing extended too far. And I think part of the reason, a big part of that is really simple. The US is just completely different in every contextual factor. And that makes it very hard to make comparisons. It's interesting as a sort of speculative thought exercise. But so, for example, and this is something that I think people don't realize enough, is that there has never been an old established democracy that turned into an authoritarian regime, except in certain cases of foreign war or occupation. So in other words, it's literally never happened before. So unless there's an unusual like World War III type situation, it would be quite literally unprecedented for America to follow in interwar Germany's footsteps. Now, I suppose there's always a first case that could emerge, but it just seems so unlikely that, to sort of belabor the analogy, I feel like it creates a sense of doom and danger that is actually not there. And the other thing I would say is not only is America a consolidated democracy where Weimar Germany was only like Germany only had about like 25 years of democratic experience or something like that. So it was a very young and therefore fragile democracy. The other thing is that, and this is where I think your article is really good, Aaron, is the importance of founding and creed. That Weimar did not have a clear founding. It had dueling foundings, and different sides of the political spectrum disagreed on what the founding moment was. Thankfully, something that the U.S. has, first of all, it's a creedal nation, so it's not based on ethnicity. It's based on ideology or ideas to some extent, at least. But also that we have a clear founding moment, at least we have up until quite recently, that isn't really contestable. And even people who contest and try to say, well, it's not just 1776, it's also 1619. There's a way of incorporating the 1619 version of America's history and sort of making it a complement to 1776. In theory, you can do that. But for the most part, people understand that there's an American idea that came about. There was a certain historical evolution, a certain set of founders, founding documents. We have our own national scripture, if you will, our Constitution and our Declaration of Independence, the Federalist Papers. That's a much stronger founding moment upon which to base a nation than anything Germany had. So those are two fundamental differences where I feel, however bad things are getting in the US, we have certain built-in advantages that make any kind of disintegration quite unlikely. And here I would just say, for the full version of this argument, Damir and I did a sort of back and forth debate, but it's not fully a debate because we kind of agree. So you can find it on the website. It's called Whatever, nice single word title, where we say, we both of us, I think, to one degree or another, we say that this Trump era might end with a collective sigh and a kind of shrugging of the shoulders, and it'll feel very anticlimactic, where it's just like, oh, this is it? Oh, cool. That the world never ended. It didn't get really bad. We're going to muddle through. We're going to figure this out. If Biden wins, which seems likely, then people will stop freaking out for the most part, at least for a few months, and then they'll find things to freak out about in 6 months. But we'll find a way to get through it. And we'll just be like, hey, life goes on.
Hit it, Aaron. Hit it.
Okay. There's a lot there, so let me try to sort of respond point by point. Well, first things first. I just would say that while I agree with you, Biden is probably going to win. If Trump wins, you yourself wrote an article saying the Democrats might not be able to concede. So, if you think that that's true, you yourself are committed to the view that there is, say, like a 10 to 12% chance, depending on what Nate Silver's forecast is today. You yourself are committed to the view that there's a 10 to 12% chance of, a major political party refusing to concede and going nuts. And, that's, I don't know. I mean, I don't think that that's going to be the end of democracy, but I think you are right in that article to say it's quite plausible that the Democrats will not be able to see a second term of Trump as legitimate. And that's going to, I think, lead to a kind of an acceleration of the delegitimation that's already been going on the left. And that's not going to be good. Not good doesn't mean collapse. I agree. But that's also a pretty low bar, right? Like, oh, well, we won't collapse. Like, okay, great. Like, that's a lot of, we're not going to have a civil war, but it's worth noting. I mean, the Civil War happened and then we were fine after it and the country moved in a better direction overall. It was still a horrible civil war that like killed hundreds of thousands of people and, was shook the nation to its core.
Okay, but
and
Aaron,
we survived,
even Shadi's
right?
not calling that it's going to be civil war. He's just worried about the legitimacy question, which is fair. I think that's a good point. But go on.
Yeah, no, I know, but my point is just you can. I think it's sort of unfair to say, well, like we're not going to end up like Weimar. Like, well, okay, but that's like that. We're not going to have the worst possible outcome.
Right. Which is good.
It's good.
That's kind of an important thing to say.
It is. So I agree it's an important thing to say, but I also think often there can be a kind of complacency that comes when you make, and this is a critique I have of the left, too, and not, or it's a critique I have of both sides, but just when you either start bringing in the Hitler analogies in the way that the resistance does, or the Soviet Union analogies in the way that the kind of, more Rod Dreher type conservatives do, I think it just distorts the sense of proportionality, both in that it can make you catastrophize, but also in that it can, in a certain sense, set the bar so low that, anything less than Soviet Union or Nazi Germany are like, oh, well, we're fine. But no, I mean, that shouldn't be the normative bar by which we sort of evaluate society. But
hold on, Aaron. I mean, to me, that's, I think normative bar is something I don't really care about ultimately, because that's going to be shifting. That's just like the nature of politics ultimately also, I think. So, whether we're fine or not, what I liked about the essay, and I think where Shadi's critique maybe I depart from, is that I don't think you really, at any point, I think you're quite careful to say that, in fact, we're not Weimar. And
No, I know.
and for all the reasons
Right,
that Shadi delineated there, I think you I think pretty deftly dispatched that
Right,
argument, saying that, in
right.
fact, we are an advanced democracy. We haven't lost the war. It's not all of it. But here's the thing, Aaron. I mean, the thing that, and this is why I was also pushing you earlier on the question of whether you're on the right or not. I wouldn't say on the right, whether you're conservative.
Sure.
But it is interesting to me the extent to which I've seen so many of my friends, especially ones that work in more avowedly conservative institutions. It's that sense, and Shadi, you and I have talked about this, that sense of being besieged in some way, and then therefore seeing like a bigger threat from this sort of, cultural leftism being everywhere and squelching things and changing things in a big way. This is why I do sort of stand by the whatever side of it. I think like a lot of this sort of leftist excess will just sort itself out because it's so silly. It's so stupid. Like specifically just on the race issue and like Black Lives Matter, ultimately it boils down to some kind of like cheesy, like self-help kind of morality, right? It's just like basically it's both like a tawdry secularized religious thing where you like visibly atone for your sins, but then you're done. No one has no thinking person can possibly think that anything having to do with that sort of like anti-racism of the Ibrahim X. Kendi variety will solve anything. So in that sense, even there, that's a self-defeating thing because people are gonna feel bad about things only for so long, and then after they've absolved themselves and publicly, gone to the efforts of confessing their sins, they're gonna be like, I did that already, and shit's still fucked up. So again, do you know what I mean? Like that element of the right's worries about the excesses of the left, I think that's just going to correct itself.
I guess my partial rejoinder would be look at the history of sort of millenarian sort of social movements in the United States and ask yourself, I mean, look, in a trivial sense, you could say they all sorted themselves out in the sense that none of them was permanent, sure. And in the sense that the excesses eventually went away, sure. But, there were people who believed in actual witches and burned them. And there were people who, under the influence of a kind of millenarian Protestant extremism, supported all sorts of social causes, some of which were good, some of which weren't, but which all, which in certain cases had teeth behind them, either the teeth of the state or the teeth of sort of the culture and just other non-state forms of coercion. But, I don't buy that just because wokeness is self-evidently stupid to you or I, that it's not going to become influential and it's not going to capture certain institutions and bureaucracies that have the capacity to inflict some kind of material punishments on people. I agree that it's not going to be like the Soviet Union or anything like that. But again, that's why I was pushing that that's sort of not a fair bar to use, because I think it is a problem if you can be fired for... I mean, look, Damir, what you just said about Ibram Kendi, there are places that would fire you instantly if you said that. You're very lucky that you don't work at one. And look, I think that, if you're on the right, in sort of conservative media or think tank world, yeah, you're not going to be fired for saying that. And I doubt that the majority of people who say that in their workplace will be fired. But at-will employment coupled with, woke HR departments and the worries about lawsuits, I mean, it just takes a few bad examples for everyone to be really scared of this and to not want to contradict it, and for there to be a kind of soft, Tocquevillian despotism that seeps into a lot of institutions.
Isn't this what America is ultimately, though? Like this, like overweeningly Protestant culture that always
no, it's deeply American. But I would. But that, to me, that just proves the point that it's a real threat.
Nah, it's American. It's America as apple pie. And here's the thing. Like, I mean, I think that the main error in that analogy is that my job is to actually do what I'm doing right now. And yeah, sure, if I worked in like some sort of like middle management, I'd watch what I say. But guess what? Like, you know, I've said this to both of you, I think, in different times. If I like am visibly drunk and like walking around the public square, masturbating like Jeffrey Toobin, like in public, I deserve to lose my job. You know what I mean?
That's not comparable to being unwoke.
Yeah.
Kind of is. It's called manners. It's just like sort of social mores and stuff like that. And I think manners ultimately are not controlled by ideology. And they're not controlled by ideology. In the sense, it's just like these things shift.
But the problem is that if the problem with this is that what you're defining as manners have ideological content. Now, maybe you could say all manners do in some sense, but I do think that comparatively, this set of manners can't be defined without reference to particular ideological propositions. And I don't know, like, to me, there's a difference between saying, you know, cover your mouth while you chew, right? Mm-hmm. That is manners, right? And that's fine. It has some normative weight, but that's not the same kind of thing as saying, it's just impolite and something you don't do to, you know, question the 1619 Project. Well, I mean, no, I think these are very different kinds of things, and I am okay with sort of arbitrary dining customs, but I'm not okay when that kind of dining custom model is then used kind of as a tool to silence ideological dissent under the guise of mannerisms.
Who's gotten fired for questioning 1619, though?
Well, I mean, what was the case of? Okay, I mean that's a bit of an extreme example, but there are tons of cases. I think Yasha Monk.
Damir, there are a bunch of cancel culture examples of people who got in trouble because they weren't sufficiently in line with the new discourse.
The first one I heard of, for what it's worth, was, I think her name was Justine Sacco, who tweeted a joke that was meant to be criticizing kind of Western complacency about AIDS, but was taken out of context, so people thought that she was making fun of people in Africa who had AIDS, when in fact the point of the joke was the opposite. And she lost her job, and it happened immediately overnight while she was on an airplane and didn't have internet. Because of how fast this moved.
She was a Biden appointee. She was an Obama appointee, right?
No. She just like worked at like a private company.
She was like
company.
A random person with like 100 followers.
And that's the danger, right? It's the random people who are not high profile.
And like David Shore, remember?
And the fact that you hear high profile cases, and the fact that there are sort of high profile cases where this happens, like say, you know, James Bennett or whatever, the fact that it can happen to people who seem to be pretty well entrenched in, you know, institutions.
I have no sympathy for Bennett.
Well, okay, I mean, I don't really either. But the point is that the fact that it happens to a few high profile people, it probably happens much more to people who aren't high profile and don't enjoy the advantages.
I've made this case before, right? And I do want to get back to the Weimar thing, because I think it's actually productive. But like, I do want to just say one thing. Part of this is this like weird distortion of Twitter. And part of it is this idea, again, that just like you can go on Twitter and run your mouth as if it doesn't matter, as if you're just talking like me and you here, like Shadi, me and you, Aaron, are like sitting around, like, having dinner and having conversation. In fact, no, we're recording this and we're going to publish it on the internet. So in fact, you know, everything I say on this, you know, even the sort of more, provocative things, I have that in the back of my mind. Too many people, I think, treat Twitter as if they're not. And in fact, you know, if you are not a public personality and you're running your mouth, I think the analogy of a public drunk actually is correct, because we do have standards for these sorts of things about what your behavior should be. And if you reflect poorly on your company, and if your job is not to be out in public, there's no reason why you certainly have no right to be running your mouth in public. That's ridiculous.
That's arbitrary. That's the problem. I don't disagree in principle with what you're saying, but the problem is the standards that we're discussing are basically arbitrary to be decided by one ideological group rather than the other, and it's not consistently applied. And so people can say absurd things that are on the woke side of the spectrum and they won't get penalized in their jobs because they're on the right side of history. And people who say something which would have been innocuous 3 years ago find themselves in a different situation. I don't like it when people feel a need to suppress their inner thoughts. Obviously, there are extreme examples of like outright white supremacy, but most of what people say, it falls somewhere in between. And I don't want a society where people, every time they go in the public arena, feel like they have to hide their true ideological or political preferences. That's the kind of world that we're getting into, especially if you're on the left, because you want to be invited to, like, I don't know, Zoom calls or dinners or happy hours or whatever. And if you say the kinds of things that I say, luckily I have a group of friends that indulge me and, and encourage me, but a lot of people don't. And I think people are sometimes impressed where they're like, Shadi, we wish we could say what you say. Well, first of all, they're white, so they can't. But that's also indicative of the problem, that because I have brown protection, I can say things that they can't. But all of this gets to the point that people are hiding their true commitments, and we don't want to live in a society like that.
Yeah.
Seems temporary to me. And unsustainable, I guess, is where I'll just sort of end on the woke thing. I mean, we've been here before, but that to me just seems like one of those things that sorts itself out. Because just like Catholic integralism has absolutely no traction in this society, and it's just like a silly little like passing thing. So same thing with Kendi and the rest of his ilk.
But that's just not true. Wait, Damir. Kendi's book is being peddled by every major Fortune 500 company, being assigned in countless K through 12 schools. That is not true of Adrian Vermeule.
No, sure, fine, but it was true of like Thomas Friedman too, and he's also like in the same sort of irrelevant category.
Thomas Friedman's worldview, I think, became pretty influential and helped influence and then justify the decision to invade Iraq.
Oh, disagree with that. That's also as American as apple pie, and it's a deeply rooted problem with America.
The point is that Thomas Friedman's worldview was pretty influential among some people with power. It's not necessarily that Tom Friedman did it. I don't know what causal role he had, if any, but he was probably more a reflection of a set of assumptions that captured certain levers of power, and then things happened, and because people had this kind of globalized view of the world and this very sort of naive faith in progress and globalization, and it's a cliche, but that's how you got Trump, right?
Well, right. So I mean, let me just then, since we're coming up on an hour, but let me just sort of try. No, it's good. But let me just sort of try and like wrap this up, and not wrap it up, but like, day. I want to, but put us on this sort of grounding here. Look, what was resonant to me about the piece, and I'm surprised, Shadi, that it didn't resonate as much with you, is that I think it provided the kind of good historical analogy for why, Shadi, I think you and I and Aaron have like a healthy contempt for the resistance, because the resistance styles itself as, quite frankly, also very much in that historical analogy of, we're opposing the ultimate evil. They don't understand that, in fact, there's a larger narrative to this. There's a much bigger narrative to how politics works and the logic of events. And there's a kind of caricatured and deeply stupid and moralizing way, like a sort of a pocket history of Weimar and Hitler's rise, that I think Aaron's essay does a good job of dismantling and basically crapping on the heads of a lot of sort of self-satisfied schmucks. So that's my point. So, Shadi, what's your beef there?
That's important, and I think that one of the good takeaways from the piece is, don't think of your opponents as enemies to be destroyed. And once you start doing that, you create a sort of succession of events that you lose control over. So yeah, I think that every single person on the left who thinks that conservatives are all evil, racist, or irredeemable, there is a real cautionary tale there. And I mean, my position has always been that all Americans, with the exception of 1% to 2% who are actual white supremacists, are within the family and within the fold, and none of them are deplorable. None of them are evil, and we can't look at them that way. And so in that sense, I 100% agree with at least one of the implications of Aaron's piece. And I think there's also a saying, as a great philosopher once said, "The perfect is the enemy." Whatever that is.
Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the
good.
good.
Yeah, whatever that is.
Yeah. Could I just say a couple quick things about
hit it.
Okay. So Damir, I would say I think you're right that was a big part of the piece, but I just think that if you actually take that to its logical conclusion, you should be a little more alarmed. Not necessarily by Ibram Kendi himself. I mean, that's kind of a distraction, but by the fact that you do see a lot of people who are not really far left, but just I think are somewhat mainstream Democrats who will either explicitly or implicitly accuse their opponents of racism, while also saying, as Joe Biden and the official Democratic Party platform says, that systemic racism, has no place in our society and must be rooted out. There's a tendency to see things like racism as kind of the American version of fascism and the ultimate evil that then is coupled with this, I think, very sort of profligate usage of the term, or sort of profligate insinuation of the term. And when you put that together, I do think you get something that's a lot more serious than just a few crackpots like Ibram Kendi. I mean, look, like when Joe Biden says, "I want to root out systemic racism," in the abstract, sure, I don't want there to be systemic racism. But when you look at how in practice people tend to interpret that term, and you couple it with the phrase "root it out."
No, but see, I think this hits at it exactly for me, why I'm just completely nonplussed by all of this, and why I think that this is my real distancing from the right on this. I ultimately exactly, and you've caveated it throughout this episode, Aaron, that you don't feel like this is actually a Soviet threat. There isn't actually a Stasi waiting to happen. It's at best a sort of like weird passive thing, and at best, again, Aaron, as you know from what's the various sort of immigrant creeds, the book
Albion Seed.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, this is straight up American as apple pie. Scarlet letter sort of stuff, and it's a spasm that courses through the country. It's always there. It manifests as prohibition that also burns itself out, and ultimately, it's a kind of Puritanism that is against human nature, and that's why Puritanism is always and it's always an unfinished sort of project.
But let me point out one just difference, right? Those waves of Puritanism were not the object of their ire was not the country itself, right? I mean, maybe you can say, well, they saw sin as being entwined in America and they had to root out sin. Okay, yeah, but they also saw America as a city on the hill, right?
Arguably, the strands of people who are really into this sort of woke thing want to redeem the whole project. I think you're right. I mean, your essay does a really good job there, again, of pointing out that the danger is to the delegitimation of the project. Yeah, because without the legitimation, you're screwed. Absolutely agree there.
That's the worry. That's the worry that I guess. And again, we don't need to litigate this now. I just would say, to put my sort of cards on the table, give it the most sympathetic rendering possible, that I'm not all that concerned about this sort of American as apple pie Puritanism in the abstract, and I'm not all that concerned about progressives having these puritanical elements. It's that the puritanical elements seem to now be targeting pretty important institutions and aspects of America itself. It's as if the Puritanism has become a kind of autoimmune disorder, and that I think you can debate whether that's new, but I think there is at least a case to be made that that is not historically how the Puritanism has worked. And I know that there are woke people who will say we're just redeeming America. I don't know. I mean, I think that's a little.
My concern is that that's kind of like a rhetorical flourish, and it's not actually something they truly believe. It's hard to know what's in people's hearts ultimately, but you wonder, and maybe it's fine if they keep it inside, that if they actually think the American idea and the project from the founding is actually illegitimate, that to me is a serious risk if a critical mass of people stop believing in the founding creed. Because if we are a creedal nation, then we need people to believe in the creed. Similar to, like, not to, extend the metaphor too much, but you could have a lot of disagreement in Islam or Christianity, which there is, but people have to still believe in the core requirements of the creed. So, if you're Christian, you have to believe that Jesus is divine, and if you're Muslim, you have to believe in the Quran as God's word. And if you don't, then it all starts falling apart. And it's an interesting question. I mean, I think James Baldwin was the one who said that the reason that I criticize my country so vociferously is because I love it. And I think there's like an older school that still really held to that idea. And Martin Luther King was obviously a proponent of this, that America is great because it has the potential to be great in the future. I think there's a new crop of elites who, went to top schools and work for top institutions and are quite privileged, who don't believe in the American idea and want to burn it all down. They still might pay tribute to the idea of America, but I wonder what they really think, and if they're in some sense dissimulating and engaging in double discourse.
So for me, I guess where I come down on this is that I have a lot of concerns about the righteous, and I have more sympathy for criticism up to a point than righteousness. So in a way, I am more put off, and this is, again, to come back to Aaron's essay on this, I'm much more put off by the hashtag resistance, who feel, and as you and I acknowledged in our back and forth, Shadi, there's a certain kind of love there, but to me, it's a kind of demented love of a sort of a half understood idea and a set of ideas that underpin this country. That is the resistance to me. They don't get it. They think they're representing some kind of virtue. Whereas wokeism, at least in this most sort of intellectual level, is a critique that I think dangerously veers to undermining a certain kind of glue for all of us. But ultimately, I don't mind a vociferous critique as much as I mind and worry about righteousness. I worry about Max Boot and Jennifer Rubin a lot more because they are the kind of, they're not communists, they're all anti-communists, but in the same sort of way, they think they're fighting Hitler, and that they have these priors that are just purely righteous. In the same way that communists felt that they had history at their back. Yeah. That to me is the big thing here, and that to me is the big raised middle finger to a lot of these people that Aaron's essay represents. To me, why it's an interesting and important essay, as opposed to where, again, I think I part ways with you, Aaron. I think it's implicit in your essay is your worries about the left. I'm not that worried, but the strength of the essay stands despite that.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say to that, since I've probably spent too much time criticizing the left, given that my essay is pretty even-handed, actually, or I'd like to think it is, criticizing the right too. I disagree very strongly with, I think, both sort of the Claremont West Coast Straussian support for Trump and the Sohrab Ahmari, Adrian Vermeule, Patrick Deneen, post-liberalism, Catholic integralism stuff, because that all in its own way is just as righteous, I find, and just as uncritical as the Ann Applebaums of the world. And I think I largely share your disposition that, because it's not fundamentally advancing. I guess some of the post-liberal stuff is advancing a critique, but when it turns into just kind of this mindless standing for Donald Trump, like Sohrab Ahmari signing some dumb declaration that's like, oh, we are writers and intellectuals in support of Trump, who's done an astonishingly good job. I mean, when I see that, it's just contemptible, and as far as I'm concerned, not all, but some of the people who signed that declaration, we should feel contempt for. But B, it's what's dangerous is I don't think they realize the extent to which they're empowering their enemies.
But are they empowering their enemies? I mean, I think that this is a small group of people on the right who have a distinctive.
Not the post-liberals, but the people who are supporting Trump, I would say yes, because I think that even if you think that stuff's going to get worse under Biden, as I do, I think wokeness will not go away under Biden at all. But I just seems so obvious to me that the persona and the grotesquerie of Donald Trump has been a huge propagandistic gift to a lot of both the woke people and the Ann Applebaum resistance types. And I think they just aren't willing to admit that. And they don't see it.
No, they don't see it. It's not that they're. Let me just say about Ann Applebaum. I mean, like I've met her a few times. She was on the board of the American Interest. I mean, I think I understand a lot of these Cold War liberals. It's a lack of self-awareness. It's not like malevolence, and that's the thing. I mean, actually, in the American Purpose, the new thing, that Frank Fukuyama and Jeff Gedman are doing now that you published in, Josh Moravchik wrote a piece reviewing this book about Never Trumpers. He makes that case very explicitly, and he himself, as I think one of the coterie of Never Trumpers, he's actually quite self-aware of it. At the same time, he doesn't see a problem with it. He points out that in fact, most of the people who supported the Iraq War for moral reasons are the same people who are so deeply offended by Donald Trump. And I mean, I think that's correct. And the important thing here is that the blind spot of moralizing about these things is the worst thing. And this gets me back to why I was so annoyed at you, Shadi, earlier when you were talking about team sports and all sorts of things about this. Because if you don't have that skepticism, and I think, okay, whatever, if you're just someone whose bread and butter is like working again, as middle management in some company somewhere, you've got a family, you got mouths to feed. Politics is something you maybe do as sport, and you consider yourself as a Democrat, and you get energized about this or that issue. You do politics like that. But I think as far as people who technically, whatever the hell we're doing for a living, that if you're that uncritical and that openly moralizing about it, and that not self-skeptical, you are a menace, an absolute menace.
Yeah.
And that's for me is like the Never Trumpers. I'm not saying that again, like this sort of thing could possibly exist without Trump. Clearly the cause of it is Trump, but it is interesting how it maps onto a whole different tendency in this country, which is just, I think, has brought a lot of misery to this country and has in fact helped create this moment that Trump has taken advantage of.
Well, I think so. I'll just say, I think that one thing that the three of us all share is that we sort of have a misanthropy that leads us to not like most people. And I think that we look at a lot of normal people on Twitter. So for example, even if I look at my feed right now, most people suck and most people are hacks. And most people don't have principles, but it's not that they're violating principles. It's that they don't believe that someone should have a coherent set of principles beyond, So we actually, Damir and I were talking about this on a group chat earlier, that he seems to be, disappointed by the fact that there's a lot of journalists who act like activists, but The thing is, there are a lot of journalists who feel that like their overarching principle is defeating Donald Trump, and if that means being dishonest about their coverage or not being balanced about their coverage, they can justify that morally. And even I have people, and I won't name names, who say, Shadi, like, we agree with like your last couple of Atlantic articles, but do you really have to write this before an election? Can't you wait until after the election? That everything has to be like any kind of thing that might hurt your own side, because for them, getting rid of Trump is because they don't have an ideology. Most people don't care about ideas. And so for them, the only thing they can direct their energy towards is getting rid of Trump. That's the be all end all.
So let's excavate this one other thing. And maybe since, we've gone over the hour, let's go another 15 minutes. Aaron.
Another 15 minutes.
You can do it. Aaron, here's the question for you. We've had these debates about morality. Talk to me a little bit about the role of morals here, because ultimately, for me, this is where I think depart from so many people's that I feel like a lot of this is this kind of weird, almost rhetorical superstructure where we end up justifying things to ourselves with sort of shorthand. But to me, ultimately, that's the big danger. I end up identifying people who moralize about these things as the true, really dangerous people. And again, I and maybe I'm wrong about this, but I think that the wokes aren't moralizing it in the same way as the resistance people. Talk to me about that.
Well, I think that the wokes and the resistance people are both moralizing, but they're moralizing about slightly different things, and they have a different moral code. I'd say that they're both sort of equally puritanical, but they have different concepts of Satan. Maybe that's the way to put it. And there's some overlap, obviously. Both the resistance and the woke think Donald Trump is Satan, but no. Look, I mean, like the really hard left, Kendi identity politics types. There's a lot more that they see as satanic than, say, I think Ann Applebaum sees. You don't want to overstate the agreement, but I think are you asking more about just sort of a broader second order question about is morality dangerous, and sort of is this moralizing spirit in American politics bad?
Arguably, it's unavoidable. I mean,
yeah,
Shadi,
right.
you and I have talked about this a lot, right? I mean, it's the sense that again, it's this sort of secularized religion, and that ends up being like a key element to it. But
well, this is literally the purpose of religion, because if there is actually Satan in the netherworld or wherever he may be, as like as a real or metaphorical existence, like you don't need to find devils in the same way in the temporal world. And this is where I feel like the religious impulse, which Americans seem to have in very heavy doses compared to some of our counterparts, but if we can't direct that energy towards traditional religion or God and the devil and an afterlife and thinking beyond this world, we have to direct that energy into everyday activity, including politics. So we're taking what should be. So here's the thing. I mean, not to go into this too much, and Damir, you'll be familiar with some of this from some of my recent writing, but that religion allows us to postpone until the next life. We can say, hey, not everything is here. Life quite literally is elsewhere or will be elsewhere. If you don't have that and you have a completely secular framework that is devoid of God, you have no choice but to basically do what religion does, and that means punishing and judging. But in this case, you punish and judge your fellow citizens because there is no religious superstructure which would normally provide that, right?
Yeah. No, that's right.
That's why we need religion.
Yeah.
Aaron, are you religious?
No, I'm not. I mean,
Yeah.
so
How do you feel about this as someone who isn't religious, but you do agree with that basic analysis?
Yeah, I mean, it seems largely true that you need something um, beyond the here and now. And you certainly should not make your sort of ultimate end politics. That's very bad. Um, Now, whether you need to make it religion in the kind of conventional sense, I'm not sure.
But hold on. But I think that there's an interesting way to think about this, right? Is my instinct completely wrong to say that wokeism is more grounded in the American faith? Maybe it misunderstands the American faith, but it's grounded in it in a way that, well, no, I guess the resistance is grounded in an understanding of the American faith as well, but it's not as reflective. To me, that's the key.
Okay, sure.
The key to the resistance mindset, the key to the whole like Never Trump movement, which is why I found myself in the last 4 years fighting it so much in whether it's on social media or writing essays, sort of trying to dismantle the strongest points of this, is that whereas the wokes make no case as to, Donald Trump being the sort of, some sort of weird aberration, in a way, what I think that why I'm less offended by this whole sort of woke movement is they look at Donald Trump and they say, oh yeah, America, sure, I recognize it. And that's correct. Donald Trump is America. It's this kind of desire to, set up America as some sort of perfection project, as opposed to, a country.
But I think,
yeah, go on.
Okay, but I think that's true, and to some extent, I share your kind of anti woke sympathies insofar as you're right. The more intellectual ones do see Trump as just an expression of pre-existing kind of American distinctives, and that all else equal, that is a more correct, nuanced view of him than what the resistance say. I agree.
Correct. Yeah.
I think the problem is that the woke people see Donald Trump as the kind of exhaustive expression of America and say that he is sort of not just maybe an important part of it or represents an important part of it, which is undeniable, but that he represents
the truth,
the dominant. Yeah.
I agree.
To be honest, right, I think, look, I get why people find him funny and charismatic in his own way, but at his worst moments, and I think we can all agree, he has had some moments that are just kind of ugly.
Yeah.
And he is an ugly person and a morally bad human being well before he became president. If you thought that he was the perfect expression of America, I don't understand how you could not want some kind of revolution. I mean, if that's all there is to this country, of course you would want to overthrow it. I mean, it makes total sense. And that's why I guess I'm not maybe quite as complacent about it as you. In some ways, this makes it better to me intellectually. It's more intellectually respectable because it's closer to the truth to see him as an expression of, part of the country. That's better than the resistance, which sees him as a total aberration. Yeah. It's intellectually more respectable, but politically and sociologically, I think it may be more dangerous, or at least it's as dangerous, because the logical conclusion of that is revolution, and the logical conclusion of seeing him as an aberration is going back to a series of very misguided policies that we shouldn't go back to, but which would not be as bad as, I think, giving the woke just carte blanche over the entire American state. So that's, I guess, what I would say. Like, I like Shadi, and I think you in different ways, I really do not want to go back to the world the Never Trumpers are defending. I think it's, bad, and I really...
Well, it never existed. But...
Yeah, it's ideal, all sorts. But I also think that, the reality is that their vision for America, of all the ones that are out there, it's certainly not the best, but it's also not the worst. And for what it's worth, I mean, because I do want to be even-handed, I think the idea, for example, that's floated around Claremont that we're going to just get rid of the administrative state, and that's tyranny, I think that's every bit as puritanical and idealized and far-fetched as what the Never-Trumpers are arguing for, and frankly would be worse if we actually did it, and much more disruptive than sort of going back to just like 1990s, Clinton era third way politics, which is really in practice what a lot of the Never Trumpers want. On the other hand, yeah. So I mean, I guess I'm not trying to defend the Never Trumpers, but I just do think it's worth asking kind of what is the logical conclusion of everyone's views and what do they want? And wanting something that you can't go back to that was kind of bad anyway, that's not good and it shouldn't be the goal. But wanting to go back to pre-New Deal America, I mean, that's more ridiculous, and that would probably be worse if we really tried it. And likewise, going to, post-liberal left, Department of Anti-Racism America, not that that's going to happen, but I mean, I think that would be a lot worse than what the Never-Trumpers want, too. And so I do think it's important to ask, like, what do these people want? And if you had to choose, gun to your head, who would you choose? And I mean, I think too here, there's this dynamic where often what would be best for the country is at variance or at odds with who would be the most fun to hang out with, right? No, I'm completely serious. Like I think I would worry a lot more about Catholic integralist Adrian Vermeule getting his way than I would about Max Boot, especially given what Adrian Vermeule has said about the Mortara case and the state's right to take Jews away, right? So I would choose Max Boot over Adrian Vermeule because I don't want the state to take my kid for any reason, right? Who I don't have, by the way, but if I did, right? But who do you think would be more fun to hang out with and talk to?
No, but Shadi, go ahead. I mean, what are you going to say?
I mean, I do have to go.
Yeah, take us out from here.
But look, I think that what's great about America, too, is that you can't actually realize your ideological objectives. So I feel like it's almost beside the point to say, well, what if a Catholic integralist got their way and was able to realize their ideal state? That's an impossibility.
Sure.
So I feel like it's a weird... That's why I can't get worked up about Adrian Vermeule and Sohrab the way that you are. And I sometimes, I feel like they're offering a helpful critique. And if you look at it as a critique of liberalism, you can see some value in it. If
like
you
woke,
take it...
Like the woke, Shadi. But anyway, go on.
The woke actually can control cultural institutions and actually wield power over people's lives. I just don't really see how that's going to happen with an unusual Catholic theocrat. So I feel like...
I agree with that.
Yeah, I do.
Take us out, Shadi. Take us out. I know you got to go.
Yes, but this is great, Aaron. Thank you for joining us. Everyone, follow Aaron Sibarium's work on Twitter by following him on Twitter. And I think
it'll be in the show notes. We'll put it in the show notes.
Yeah, just Aaron Sibarium, pretty much. But but definitely read his article. It is long, but you will enjoy it. You'll benefit from it. And I think you'll learn a lot, even if you end up disagreeing with some of his conclusions. That's what we love to do with Wisdom of Crowds, is bring the most intellectually interesting and provocative people who are also generous in spirit in terms of being open to other ideas and open to us challenging them. We took it easy on Dear Aaron. We weren't as tough as we could have been.
Really?
You thought?
I think you just didn't bring your A game, Shadi. I thought that was...
But honestly, it's actually such a good... It's not a piece that you can really attack all that much. And like, we wouldn't bring someone on whose piece we would actually attack, because then we wouldn't then it wouldn't be like an intellectually... Anyway, I don't know, whatever.
Next week, Ann Applebaum.